Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners. We're here again today to talk about the residential backyard chicken keeping ordinance. This is an adoption public hearing continued from June the 8th. So for my presentation today, I will go into a little bit of background. I wanted to make sure that we summarize the elements of the ordinance once more, and then I will cover the information that we reviewed and discussed on June the 8th at the hearing. I will address some of the items of concern that came up. I'll do a quick summary, and then I will go into the action requested. I did want to point out that you have the full ordinance in your packet. So as a background, I wanted to mention that over the years, we've had a lot of residents' interest in this program. This started back in 2013, continued through 2016, and even recently, we've had more than 50 emails coming in from residents in the past, residents recently interested in this program. And particularly, I wanted to point out the intent for why we brought this up in the first place. We're looking at sustainability and resilience in our communities. We want to empower our residents to lead healthier lifestyles and help our children learn where their food comes from and be a part of that process. And we want to strengthen our food systems. Resilience is very important. We've seen that during the pandemic. A lot of people pursuing chicken keeping because they couldn't get eggs in the grocery store. So we want to strengthen those food systems in our local area. And I want to mention again that it aligns with similar programs that we have in the municipalities within Orange County and within counties surrounding us. So I did throw in this chart, which we've seen quite a while ago, but it's the framework of our existing programs in the local area, and it shows that some of them started as pilots, moved to an ordinance and a specific date. They're very much like what we have proposed, a maximum of 4 chickens, a specific number of permits, training required, which is a very important element of our program, is that UF-IFAS training program that everyone will be required to take if they want to get a permit in our program. And then setting some setbacks for the property boundaries, and then coop standards, which are also very important to the success of a program like this. And I'm sorry I went quickly, but I did want to mention that in keeping in touch with those local municipalities, they run very smoothly and have very few issues. But I did want to also mention that in speaking with the City of Orlando, they remind us that not everything is perfect every single day. And sometimes it takes additional education and additional work to work with the residents that are in the program to help them understand that certain things need to change in the way that they're doing things. So it's a growing process, and it requires attention, but right now very, very smoothly run and very few issues. So very quickly, I want to go through the elements of our ordinance once again. As we are looking at our use table, section 3877, we're amending the zoning districts in that area. And then we have our proposed ordinance framework, which updates chapter 38, section 3879 with a new subsection, number 37. The definitions in the ordinance point specifically to chickens being Gallus domesticus. We also have our application requirements, which require that educational training, as I mentioned. We include good hygiene practices for the care and keeping. We have good standards for construction, coop construction, cleaning and maintenance, properly securing chicken feed, and proper waste management, including composting. We have coop and pen area standards, as I stated, that include setbacks, but also a visual neighbor barrier and protection and the standards for protection of predators. We have access to food and water at all times, rodent and wildlife proof feeders and storage containers, I already mentioned. And then we have additionally the idea that this program, as I've mentioned in the past, is about personal egg consumption. So it is not about the sales of any kind. It does not include any slaughtering of any kind. And the chickens are required to stay in the coop and pen area at all times. So remaining under the custody and control of the resident should they take them out of the coop and pen for any reason. The expectations of compliance are very clearly stated in the ordinance. What kinds of poultry and fowl are prohibited, especially roosters. And we also have the right to allow our county employees to go onto the property in case they need to look at any compliance issues. And we have the right to have your permit revoked if you have any compliance issues. And then lastly, I wanted to address that we have a limited number of permits available. As you might remember from the June the 8th, the permit recommendation, which is something else you would need to approve today, was 130 permits with a permit fee, which you will also need to approve today, of $57. If the ordinance is repealed at some point, the permittees that already have chickens can keep the chickens for 10 years, and then after that, remove the chickens, the coops, and the pens. The effective date for the ordinance at this point will be moved to 1 November 2021. And I did want to mention that you have your the updated use table in Appendix A, which I'll go over in a minute. But our additional amendments, as we discussed on June 8th, are related to that use table. So showing the items that we discussed on June 8th with respect to the use table, we were adding an additional 2 zoning districts to the use table. As I mentioned, that is in the bottom, our neighborhood residential, our neighborhood center, and our neighborhood activity corridor. Neighborhood center and neighborhood activity corridor are part of the overall neighborhood districts, and they are a part of a District 6 Holden Heights area special overlay in the future land use component of the comp plan. So we want to remain consistent there. We had already included neighborhood residential, and we want to add in neighborhood center and neighborhood activity corridor to be consistent and to allow for ease of application of applying the permit. This is the use table with those updates. I wanted to point out again, as I did on June the 8th, this is inserted into the agricultural section of the use table under agricultural production, the raising and keeping of poultry, which is already there, and that 37P is what you see added to the zoning districts that we are recommending. Very quickly, because we've had some questions about this, I wanted to mention some of the items that are important in program implementation. So aligning with some of the programs in our area, Orlando and Winter Park have a very structured approach to completing the application for your permit, and we want to do the same. Step 1 being to review the rules so that you have a nice one-page overview of what's required to be in this permitted program. One thing that we plan to include in there is talking to your neighbors. Being a good neighbor, consulting your neighbor, letting them know about your interest, letting them know that you are pursuing a backyard chicken permit is a good thing to create that, good neighbor, getting along with your neighbors kind of approach. And then secondly, we've had questions about this. We'll have a check your property zoning type. So before anyone spends any time or money taking the class, completing the application, or paying for a permit, they need to ensure that they fall into the zoning districts that I outlined earlier. And then we'll have the opportunity to complete your application and pay your fee, and then move forward to installation. So for a summary of our June 8th hearing, we had 2 residents that spoke in favor, very much interested in the value of education for their children. You saw them here that night. And looking at that national trend for a more urban lifestyle that includes some of these elements of sustainable living, growing things in your backyard, having backyard chickens, things like that. We had 2 residents here speaking in opposition, raising concerns about noise and smell, rodents, predators, the closeness to their properties, and free-range chickens, those chickens that people are allowing to just run around their backyards. And then the other items that we discussed during that hearing was what about the possibility of neighbor consent, or that being a good neighbor and letting your neighbors know that you're going to have chickens, compliance issues, an already taxed compliance system and not wanting to add to that, and then free range, as I mentioned, chickens just wandering around, or those roaming chickens that are up and down streets in different areas of the county that nobody claims. So we had discussions about that, and we ultimately decided to look into some of these issues, so the continuation was made to today. So I've summarized those issues, and we put them in sort of two buckets so that we could try to address them. The first is compliance concerns, those unowned roaming chickens, the ones that are wandering up and down the street that nobody will claim. The unwanted chickens, so what about if someone's in this permitted program and they just don't want their chickens anymore? Are they just going to set them free and contribute to that roaming chicken problem? And then the added compliance cases. What about making sure that the people who join this program stay in compliance, and what kind of burden will that be on our compliance system, including the issues that were mentioned about the current chicken keepers that are out there right now who are not permitted, who are not supposed to have chickens to begin with, and they're causing some of these compliance concerns. And I did want to point out that those are the people that are not in a program like this. They don't have guidelines, they don't have structure, they haven't been given standards, and most likely have not been trained in the class. So they're out there doing whatever they want without the rules that we could supply in an ordinance like this. Secondly, we did talk about our neighbor concerns, and we looked at them from the closeness element, those sort of issues of noise, smell, rodents, predators, and diseases, about free-range chickens, people just letting them go in their backyard, wandering around during the day, and then the awareness of neighbors. This is a new land use, should the neighbors be told? So I'm going to go into some of those concerns, but before I do, I want to talk specifically about some of those topics of noise and smell, predators, diseases, and things like that. So I had intended to have our IFAS livestock agent here today, J.K. Yarborough, to speak to these items, and unfortunately he is sick and could not make it, and so is our director of UF IFAS here, Kevin Cam. So they are both out ill, and they could not attend with us here today. They are watching, but not able to take questions at this time. So I will be briefing their slides for them, and I will be certain to get back with you if you have any very specific questions. So noise and smell, I did want to talk about when chickens make noise. And mostly we want to talk through these things because in the past, there's been some discussion about these topics, and we want to make sure that we're clarifying this information. It's important for the facts to be stated correctly, and we want to supply from our IFAS extension agent that information. So first, I'll cover when do chickens make noise, usually because of two things, or usually the two factors are loudness and the duration of that loudness. The peak loudness of chickens is about 65 decibels, so something like squawking. The average outdoor conversation between two people at 6 feet peaks at 72 decibels. The maximum chicken vocalization is generally 2 times during the day. It could be in a moment of stress, but also after they lay an egg. So the duration of the egg song, as they call it, is about 0 to 10 minutes. So JK and I went out to visit some sites in the area, and we took a decibel measuring device with us that we borrowed, and tried to get some measures on the chickens within the coops. We actually fed the chickens to kind of get them excited with a special treat so that we could do measurements. And what we actually found was that we couldn't even get a registered measurement of 65 decibels. Even standing 10 feet away, it was even less. 5 feet away, we couldn't even get that kind of peak loudness from the chickens. And part of that is because of the ambient noise around us. There were lawnmowers, there were people doing construction, there were so many planes going overhead that we couldn't even actually hear each other talking. So getting those measures and showing that the chickens during the day really are not reaching peak decibel levels over 65 for sure. And then I did want to also point out that chickens sleep at night. They are not up all night clucking. When the sun starts to set, they go inside their coop in their roosting area, and they roost for the evening and come out in the morning. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Then for the smell, smell is usually derived from two sources, waste and feed spoilage. So it's the chicken waste that needs to be cleaned up regularly, and having a good, proper absorbent bedding helps during the week, and then cleaning that coop on a weekly basis, which is a standard within our ordinance. Feed that is spilled can also create spoilage and create smell, and so we expect that people are cleaning up that feed that's spilled and asking them to look at that on a daily basis, and at least in the weekly basis of cleaning their coop. The next slide is about rodents and predators. Chickens, what about backyard chickens would attract rodents? It's really that feed. It's the access to the feed, it's the spilled feed, and it's the source of where the feed is stored. So we do have in our ordinance that we are using rodent-proof and wildlife-proof feeders and containers, and as is mentioned here, keeping those feeders up off the ground can be of benefit. Then chickens are susceptible to predation. So we heard some discussions last time about hawks, about raccoons, different things going after the chickens, and they are susceptible to predation. And that's why we've set very strong coop standards. These coop standards are taught in the class, and they include that very strong hardware cloth, that woven wire that is buried 12 inches into the ground on the all around the coop and pen area to keep digging predators from getting underneath the wire, underneath the hardware cloth. So the other thing we have in our ordinance is that chickens are required to stay in their coop and pen area. They're not allowed to be free-range chickens. We are not letting them out in the day to go around our backyard. The goal is to size your coop and your pen area accordingly, and the chickens will be very happy in the space provided based on the standards that we have within our ordinance. And then lastly, I wanted to talk quickly about salmonella and other diseases. This is biosecurity practices that are taught in the class. The salmonella contraction is extremely low, especially when following these practices of washing your hands before and after, using hand sanitizer, keeping separate shoes and clothes for going in and out of the coop and for handling the chickens. And then composting waste can be very beneficial, and then making sure that you're cooking your eggs. So all of this is taught in the class to ensure that people can keep themselves safe from this kind of disease. The CDC tracks these outbreaks regularly. I have the stats up there of 672 illnesses, only 5 in the state of Florida for this year. So as I move on to the next section, I wanted to address some of the other concerns that I had grouped into the compliance category. First, unowned roaming chickens. These are the chickens that don't belong to a property, so there is no violation. There's no one that we can cite with a violation. And they're not right now being removed by code compliance or animal services. So this was a discussion that we've had multiple times. We felt like it was something that was really impacting everyone's view of whether or not this type of program could be successful when we have these compliance issues out there right now. So we've had some conversations among divisions and departments, and the solution that we have in process right now is a contract that Animal Services will be pursuing to capture and relocate these chickens. So getting a contractor that can do this work for us to get out there in the community when people are reporting chickens wandering up and down streets and taking care of that problem. So I wanted to put that out there right now as part of the compliance concerns. The other concern was these unwanted chickens. Suppose people don't want them anymore. What are they supposed to do with them? What if they just let them free? And then the issue of non-compliant chickens. So if you're in the permitted program and you have a permit, but you've been getting violations and you're not staying compliant and your permit gets revoked, you need to have a place to take your chickens. So we did want to point out that in these cases it is the responsibility of the permittee to remove the chickens. If you have had your permit revoked, you will have to remove the chickens within 15 days of when that permit was revoked. So that is something that we are adding into the ordinance to make sure that that 15 days is acknowledged, that if you lose your permit as part of our program, you have to get rid of your chickens. We also have in the in the ordinance that chickens can be transferred to another property that has a permit in good standing, and that chicken suppliers, we've visited several of the chicken suppliers, they're willing to help relocate chickens. They're willing to take them back in and find other homes for chickens for people who either don't want their chickens or lose their permit. The added compliance cases, we've talked a lot about this. We reviewed the 311 process calling. We've looked at the number of calls that came in just in this year alone. We ensured that how they're being call routed, and we've put in a flow to handle certain specific conditions so that we can make sure that we're routing these compliance cases in a proper manner and as quickly as possible. We are looking at providing the training. This type of IFAS training class that's available for the residents can be offered to code compliance and animal services officers so that they can more quickly address the concerns that are taking place with our permittees and try to get those resolved as quickly as possible. And then we also have our IFAS livestock agent, JK, who is willing to provide additional educational support. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes it takes time for someone to understand why what they're doing is not working, and they might need his support, and that might be a phone call and it might be a visitation. So I wanted to mention in summary for compliance concerns that the recommendations we're making to add to the ordinance today is a reference to address the noise and the smell concerns. It's just a reference to Chapter 5, Section 5-42, addressing nuisance animals, which is animal services responsibility as a portion of dealing with those types of compliance issues. So they will handle the noise and the smell issues through their normal citation process. Nothing new, what they already do, but they will handle those specific complaints. Another recommendation that we're adding to the ordinance today is that is what I just mentioned about it is the owner's responsibility to remove the chickens in 15 days if your permit is revoked. So those two items will come back up again during action requested as elements to be added for clarification in the ordinance. Now we'll talk about an option that we're presenting for you all today, and that is a 2-year pilot program with 75 permits. So if you feel that we haven't done enough to deal with the compliance issues, if you feel that we haven't addressed the potential concerns that could still be out there about being able to handle compliance for our permittees in this permitted program, you have the option to address this more like a pilot program with a limited number of permits, so cutting the permits in half. That gives us the opportunity to track fewer permits, to keep track of the compliance of our permittees in this permitted program, and the opportunity for some of those residents out there that are having chickens and non-compliant right now to try to bring them into the program and make them be successful chicken keepers. And then this would be set to sunset in 2 years. So if we don't come back to renew and make it into a permanent ordinance, this pilot program would sunset and there would be no more permits available at that point. But once again, anyone who had a permit would have this clause to keep their chickens, their coop, and their pen up to 10 years, and then they must remove them. So now going into some of the neighbor concerns. The first thing that we did was look at this closeness issue of neighbors. So we wanted to look at locations and setbacks. And so we started by looking at what our current setbacks were listed as. And the first thing we did was look at different property types and how they impacted, how these setbacks played out and impacted certain property types. And as we did that, we looked at the local backyard chicken program standards from the area. And as you can see, for our location and setbacks, we have 15 feet minimum from the side and side street property boundary and a 10 feet minimum from the rear property boundary. So as we looked at the other local programs, Orlando has 5 feet, Winter Park 10 feet and 7.5 feet, Winter Garden, Maitland, Longwood 7.5 feet. You see Osceola at 15 feet and then Seminole at 10 feet. So as we looked at our setbacks, we felt that they were conservative enough and very much in line with the other programs, if not more conservative than what the other successful programs are already doing. So at this point, we are not making any recommendations to increase our setbacks. As we looked at the potential for increasing the setbacks 5 feet each, we found that it eliminated many of our smaller property types. And our goal here is to be as equitable and as inclusive as possible. Any resident who can meet the requirements of our program should have the opportunity to be in this program and should not be eliminated just because they only live on a 5,000 square foot lot. So we did not pursue those lot sizes. We relied on our setbacks to do that job for us wherever it was necessary. The next slide shows an option that we did consider. So as looking at the setbacks, we discovered that something that the other ordinances had that we have never had in our ordinance was a distance to a neighboring structure. So a building separation from your neighbor's residential structures. So an option that we are supplying for you here today is a minimum of 20 feet from a pre-existing primary residential structure on abutting properties. That way we can add an additional layer on top of our already very conservative setbacks to increase that distance from your neighbor's property and your neighbor's structure. And as you can see, I put the other local program standards up there. Some of them are 20 feet, some of them are 25 feet. We pursued 20 feet, and I wanted to show you a quick example on a 50-foot lot with our current 10-foot and 15-foot setbacks. That's in the red. We applied the 20-foot buffer. As you can see on this type of a small lot with the structures in place as they are, it does increase the boundary a little. So that small, not colored in box behind that property type is where the coop would have the opportunity to go. If we increased that to a 25-foot buffer, if you can imagine that small green area increasing slightly, it would almost leave no space for a coop. So looking at a property size, this is a property that is zoned R1. It was a little over 5,000 square feet. If we started with a 25-foot buffer, once again, we'd be eliminating a lot of property types. So we're sticking with the 20-foot buffer, which will allow additional distance from a neighboring structure without eliminating some of those properties. So lastly, we'll talk about the item of neighbor concern. That was letting your neighbors know, and in this particular case, this is the option of a letter of no objection. So at the last hearing, I mentioned that I did not think that Winter Park had put this in place, but in fact they had. They hadn't recommended it, and their city attorney did not want to recommend it. But during their final hearing, it was added in at the last minute as a requirement to get the permit. Right now, Winter Park has 2 permits that they've given so far. They've had about 8 permits go through the system. Some of them go through the system 2 and 3 times before they can achieve this signature sign-off. So, and that is increasing the length of time it's taking for anyone to get a permit. And so their sustainability coordinator feels that this is very limiting for the success of their program, and they are a pilot program, so she'll be looking at eliminating that once their pilot program ends. So we are giving the option today of a letter of no objection as well. The pro for this would be that it would address this, what if your neighbors don't think this is a good idea. The con would be legally, it seems a little dubious, placing the property owner's land use rights in the hands of their neighbors. So decisions about what you do with your property is in the hands of your neighbor with this type of a letter. So in summary, culturally, we're seeing this move to more sustainable, healthy lifestyles. We've seen it around us in our area. We've seen it nationwide over a decade. And this program that we're proposing here today is very much consistent with the comp plan, with our sustainability plan from 2014 for our community, and with recommendations that were made in the transition team report. So pursuing this program and the strict guidelines that we've put in place, we feel very confident about, especially with some of the options that you can discuss today. Surrounding programs are very successful. With our ordinance just the way it is, we believe that we can be just as successful as the other local programs in the area. We know that the education from our IFAS Extension Office is a key to success. We know that clear standards, setting clear expectations, as I mentioned, the people out there now don't have standards, they don't have expectations, they don't have guidelines, and they probably haven't been trained. If we're issuing permits through this program, it's very clear what the expectations are of the permittees in our program. And we feel that we can, that citizens will step up and meet these requirements as they acknowledge them through the permitting process. And then we know that ongoing connections with permittees is the key to success as well. So we have the commitment of our IFAS livestock agent to help with some compliance issues, to do that educational aspect. The sustainability team will be helping with tracking the permits that are out there, ensuring that if a permit needs to be revoked, it is revoked. Tracking if someone moves, because as I mentioned, these permits are, they stay with the property, but they don't transfer. So they don't transfer if you move away, and they don't transfer to the person who moves into the property after you. They'll have to get a new permit. So we've committed to keeping these ongoing connections going and making sure that this process can run smoothly. So the amendments that you'll be looking at today for this backyard chicken program are as presented on June the 8th, so the additions of those 2 zoning districts that I mentioned earlier. This recommendation of the reference to Section 5-42 for nuisance animals, just because we want to ensure that the proper citation is done with respect to noise and smell. And then the recommendation for the owner responsibility to remove their chickens after 15 days if they get their permit revoked for non-compliance issues in our program. And then any other changes that the board would like to address today. So the action requested is to make a finding consistent with the comp plan, the adoption of this ordinance amending Chapter 38 of our Orange County Code for residential backyard chicken keeping with an effective date of November the 1st, 2021, establishing the maximum number of permits to be 130, and establishing a permit fee of $57, and then allowing staff to make any amendments consistent with today's board direction and correct any Scrivener's errors. In quick summary, these were the additional possible amendment options that I offered to you today to deal with some of the concerns that we heard in the last public hearing, and that is requiring the building separation a minimum of 20 feet from pre-existing primary residential structures on abutting properties, the launch of a pilot program for 2 years with 75 permits, or requiring a neighbor letter of no objection from abutting property owners. There is some discussion that you all can have about these items, but I would like to say you can put one of them in place, you can put all 3 of them in place, you could put 2 of them in place. You can look at them separately or together as a group. And with that, that is the summary of my presentation today, and I'll be able to take any questions following the public comment portion.
I really wanted to thank Lori, Jeff. You all worked so hard with the research and the, looking at every word and every detail and the examination of the surrounding counties. And I think that there, as much as I will miss, if he's listening today, Steve Hudek's puns and egg jokes in the paper, we've got to get this across the finish line as it was written so that we can be really fair to the residents in this county when they compare themselves to their neighbors across the street who live in one of the municipalities that already has one of these very successful programs. I think everybody here sort of covered some of the things I thought I might want to try to remind people of, but obviously food security is an issue. It's an ongoing issue. It's going to continue to be an issue. And the idea of being able to have self-sustaining residents, to me, feels, like a gift that we couldn't do in many other settings. I think the other thing that has come up a little bit, but I loved when I read about it and dug in a little further, and that's a little Steve Hudak pun, is that there are, literally pest control, that chickens like to eat little worms in the pest control, that the idea that they are a pest versus the fact that they can be pest control, that they, I having dinner with my friend in Winter Garden who is able to keep hers, and I'm getting ready to scrape my plate off at the end of dinner, and she's like, no, don't throw that away, that goes in with the chickens. And I'm like, okay, extra salad, little blueberries. So even, that cycle of waste that we're seeing grow every single month closes. So I, for one, am obviously, very supportive of this, if for no other reason than the fairness factor of the people who live in those municipalities being on the same page as people who live in unincorporated Orange County. And I understand that there are concerns about, neighbor disputes, but my goodness, we know this, it happens, and, those are the things that we try to help work through. This ordinance actually provides the mechanism to really structure something so we don't have those problems. This is the preventative tool to get us to good neighbor relations when people want to engage in this. And I loved the point about that right now with people still doing virtual school, this is a hands-on education. And with, many of us feeling very isolated during the pandemic, it's also a full engagement of something physical and emotional. So I do think there's so many layers of benefit, and I hope we can get it across the road. Oh, wait, Chris Esterman joke, get it across the road finally. Thank you, Lori.
Make the chicken cross the road.